Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. This week, I talk cougars. While the animals are not a common part of the Wisconsin landscape, periodically, cougars are sighted in Wisconsin. And recently, there have been some sightings in residential areas that have garnered a lot of attention. I sat down with Scott Walter, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources large carnivore specialist, to get the scoop on the recent sightings and what people should do if they come across a cougar in the wild.
The thing to remember is act large, act aggressive, maintain eye contact, raise your hands, clap your hands, yell at the animal, throw rocks, throw a stick, convince it that you know it's there and it's not going to surprise you. It's not going to sneak up on you. And you're not something it wants to mess with. More than likely, it's going to run away.
In addition to cougars, Walter also oversees the development and coordination of bears and wolves in the state. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from Beloit College and has a master's degree and doctorate in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In addition to talking about cougars, we also discussed the challenges of having a high-profile wildlife job. But first, we dug into the recent sightings and what those say about the presence of cougars in Wisconsin. Starting with the recent sightings that have been over in the eastern side of the state. A lot of people probably saw some of the recent news reports, saw maybe some of the images, the trail cam video, or images and home surveillance footage. But could you give me a little rundown of some of the recent confirmed sightings and what we're seeing in Wisconsin?
Sure. Sort of in general, Craig, we've had cougars confirmed in Wisconsin 8 out of the last 9 years. So the string of sightings already in 2018 in southeast Wisconsin really isn't unusual, although the location in the relatively heavily populated southeast part of the state is certainly interesting and has led to perhaps more public interest than we've had in the other sightings. But in 2018 alone, we've had cougars sighted in Fond du Lac County, Dodge County, Washington County, Waukesha County, all likely the same animal, because if you look at the time series, the animal's moving sort of from the Fond du Lac area down southeast into the sort of Milwaukee metro area over the last couple of months. But yeah, we've had sightings this year, but we've had essentially cougar sightings most years in the last decade.
So would you say, is it trending upward that we're seeing more sightings over time, or is it just kind of like we get this, one or two every year, and it's just the kind of a consistent thing? Are we going up? Are we going down as far as sightings?
Well, I think the time scale there is important. I think if you look 20 or 30 years ago, confirmed cougar sightings were rare to non-existent in Wisconsin. But over the last decade, maybe 15 years, they're common. I don't mean cougars are common, but every year we tend to get one or two confirmed cougars in the state. So from that perspective, they're more common than they were a couple decades ago.
And you mentioned that it's kind of a strange thing for them to where they're showing up this year. Do you have any understanding of why maybe they might be ending up in the more heavily populated areas of the state versus maybe northern Wisconsin?
Well, we tend to get most of our confirmed cougar sightings in the northern part of the state, but the individual cougars involved are likely young dispersing males. We've been able to collect genetic samples from a number of these cats over the years and confirm the origins of at least a couple as being the Black Hills area of western South Dakota. And it's typical for young male cougars to disperse. In fact, these males can travel incredible distances. One of the cougars that we collected genetic material from in 2010 or 11 ended up being killed in Connecticut, if you can believe that. And when you look at the lines on the map of where this cougar was sighted, he traveled about 1,600 miles. That's one animal. So the cougars tend to come across the forested parts of Minnesota and then enter northwest Wisconsin. And it's not uncommon in many years to have sightings in Douglas County, up in that corner of the state. But of course, those cats, being young males, are looking for young females, so they keep moving. And those cougars that enter there in the northwestern part of the state keep traveling around and can really show up anywhere. There are many sightings of cougars in recent years in the UP of Michigan. Those cats probably came through a few of our Wisconsin counties on their way up there, but if they don't turn left when they hit Superior, they turn right. They're going to end up drifting down into southern Wisconsin. And this most recent cougar just kept going until he got sort of caught down there in the more populated southeast part of the state.
What do the numbers of sightings suggest about how many cougars are actually in the state on a regular basis? Do you have an idea of the scale?
Yeah, I think we're probably seeing most of the cats, this is just my own feeling, that are spending significant amounts of time in Wisconsin. Again, these dispersing males tend to move considerable distances. So there's certainly individual cats that pass through the northern part of the state, and then again, maybe off into the UP of Michigan without being detected. But with hunters out in the woods, people out in the woods, or trail cameras all over, if a cougar spends a significant amount of time in the state, we're likely to have some evidence that it's here or has been here in the recent past. So in terms of how many cougars, not many, certainly. Again, we're 600 miles from the nearest known breeding population. So these are just individual cats, again, usually, if not always, young males. And when they get into the state, if they spend time here, we're likely to see them. So the confirmed sightings we have, I would say, are a fairly large slice of the total number of cougars that pass through the state.
And obviously, when people see these cougars, there's maybe some apprehension, especially when they see them like on a surveillance camera, kind of checking out a home. I think people will maybe get a little bit apprehensive. Is this something that people should be worried about at all, just as far as their own safety, their kids' safety, their pet safety?
Well, I don't know if worried is the right word. I certainly would say it's very important to be aware that an animal like a mountain lion or a cougar is in the area. It's interesting. This cougar recently in southeast Wisconsin's initiated just an awful lot of interest. There's been news stories, newspaper articles written on it, a lot of social media out there about these sightings. To a large extent, that's because cougars are unusual in the state. They're very rarely seen. They're new. People don't have experience with them. But if you look at urban areas in the western U.S., more in the heart of established cougar range, cougars and people coexist frequently. Even in the suburbs, the outskirts of Los Angeles, where housing developments have crept up into the mountains, into cougar range, if you look at some of the research that's been done on radio-collared cougars, they're living right in amongst people. And not only are negative interactions, attacks, very rare, and oftentimes the people don't even know they're there because they're hanging out in wooded draws or sort of out of the public eye. So in that context, having this normally behaving cougar here in southeast Wisconsin shouldn't really initiate worry. It certainly generated a lot of interest and concern amongst these folks who aren't used to cougars, but it certainly would behoove people to be aware that it's out there because this is, 100 to 120 pound animal that is a large carnivore.
Is there a plus to this at all? You mentioned there's a lot of social media activity about the cougars in Wisconsin and the recent sightings. Is there any plus for you in the sense that you get to have a conversation with people about these animals and other large animals that are, in our ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great point, Craig. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the upsides of this is for the last few weeks, for the last 2 months, really, wildlife has been, at least for a few minutes during part of the day, at the forefront of people's minds. And as a wildlife ecologist, oftentimes we try to manage for and promote wildlife conservation in the face of sometimes, public disinterest in what we're trying to do. But this cougar's got people thinking about wildlife. And I think it's it's great. And I hope that now that the window's been opened, people start to understand that, the coyotes, the fox, the squirrels in their backyard are also wild animals or wildlife, and they're very interesting and worth thinking about and learning about in their own right.
So you mentioned you think that this cougar that we're seeing and some of the ones in the past that have come through Wisconsin are likely coming from a breeding population in South Dakota. Can you tell me a little bit about that population out there and a little bit of where they disperse from there? I'm sure they go to other states as well.
Sure. I might actually back up a little bit further. Sure. Because I think it's important that people understand that the arrival over the last 10 or 15 years of these young male cougars in Wisconsin is sort of a chapter in a book, the book of cougars over the last 200 years in North America. And what we're seeing is actually a sign of range expansion, these cougars trying to push into new territory. And I'll start this story, if you'll allow me to turn to chapter 1.
Sure.
It goes back to the days of westward expansion, right? The middle 1800s, where the settlers and covered wagons were heading west, and they're trying to tame a wilderness, right? It was manifest destiny, and we had folks going out trying to find 160 acres where they could raise some livestock, plant some crops, and exist. And during those years, the latter part of the 1800s, early 1900s, predators were an obstacle. They were viewed as varmints, vermin, pests, all these adjectives. They were hunted very intensively. There were predator control programs, wolves, bears, cougars or mountain lions. Poison was used, strychnine. So they were pushed, the cougar that existed into the middle part of the 20th century, the middle 1900s, were those that lived in only the most remote areas, away from human settlements and areas where they would be persecuted. But of course, along came a conservation ethic, folks like John Muir, folks like Aldo Leopold, and we began to understand that we can live with wildlife. And we began to establish managed hunting seasons. We began to regulate harvest. We passed things like the Endangered Species Act to protect the animals that a century before we were trying aggressively to eliminate. So once that happened in the latter part of the 1900s, we began to see cougars sort of creeping out as numbers built into new areas. And instead of retreating, they began to expand their range. This population, established population you mentioned in western South Dakota, that's fairly recently established from populations in the Rocky Mountains in western Montana, say. So that population itself may only be 30 years old or so, but it's established now, and young males from that population are now expanding southward. There have been cats that have shown up in Missouri and Texas. Northward, they've shown up in Canada, the UP of Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, even the cat I referenced in Connecticut. Okay, so when people hear about, or maybe if they're lucky, even see one of these cougars, again, understand it. It connects the people of Wisconsin, not just to a cougar population out west, but it connects us to our past in terms of our entire developing and evolving relationship with nature and wildlife in particular. So it's kind of a neat story.
What's kind of the general state of the cougar population in North America right now? I'm assuming they're an endangered. They're still on the endangered species list. Just kind of what's the state of that entire population?
Well, they're not on the endangered species list. They actually are hunted in states that have healthy cougar populations that can sustain that harvest. In states like Wisconsin, again, we don't have an established breeding population that we know of. There's no evidence that there's been litters born recently, but in Wisconsin, where they're not common, they're protected. So it varies. It depends on where you are, but in areas further west, there are healthy and expanding populations of cougars.
And is there any interest by the state to reintroduce them or to start a breeding population in Wisconsin at some point in the future?
There's a common perception that when something like a cougar shows up that the state, the DNR, has released it, and I can say emphatically that's never been done. We have no interest in introducing or releasing cougars or many other wildlife species. When we do that, there's a lot of public input. When we released wild turkeys, for example, there was a lot of public input, a lot of forethought, a lot of very transparent communication about where we want these turkeys, why we want to introduce them. But with something like a cougar, certainly we would never reintroduce this animal because they may arrive on their own. Their range is expanding. So once they're here, if they make it here in a breeding sense, then management will become certainly the domain of the DNR.
Do you think that's a likely scenario that at some point that enough of them will end up here that they form a little community of cougars and start making their own cougars here in Wisconsin?
Well, I would say it depends. Again, given that we're 600 miles or thereabouts from the nearest breeding population, to answer that question, I'll explain a little bit about cougar ecology. First of all, as I mentioned, the males can disperse incredible distances, but about half the females in an established population don't disperse at all. They establish adult territories near where they were raised as kits themselves. The males disperse. The females that do disperse don't disperse nearly as far as males. I mentioned the longest recorded dispersal distance for a male cougar is about 1,600 miles. The longest recorded dispersal distance of a female cougar that I'm aware of is about 250 miles. So there is the limiting factor that it might be interesting for people to understand. If we're 600 miles from the nearest cougar population, females are pretty important because they make little cougars, right? But females only disperse no more than 250 miles. We're not likely to see a cougar from South Dakota or western North Dakota or western Nebraska make it to Wisconsin. It's possible. There could be a female that shows up. But that becomes much more likely if a population were to become established, say, in northern Minnesota, which is heavily forested, suitable, low human population densities, perhaps suitable cougar habitat. If that were to happen, if we hear that there's evidence of a breeding population in Minnesota, and that population is managed and allowed to grow, then it's inevitable that we end up at some point with cougar breeding activity in Wisconsin. But again, it's not the individual sightings we've seen recently are a long way from an established breeding population because of that behavior of the cougars themselves.
When they come here, what the heck are they up to? What are they eating? Where are they living? What is their interaction with Wisconsin? I mean, what's their food and where do they live while they're here?
Yeah, and that's neat. With any wildlife, you can look at a rabbit in your backyard. You can look at a hawk up on a post. You get such a narrow slice. That observation gives you just a very narrow slice into their existence. And for folks interested in wildlife, we spend a lot of time wondering, what are they doing? Where are they going? What are they feeding on? And really, that's what drives the public's fascination with wildlife. With regard to these individual cougars that we're seeing passing through Wisconsin, they're young males, and they've got one thing on their mind, and that is a female. That's why they move so far. That's why they keep moving. If this young male were to find a young female, that might stimulate him to settle down, establish a territory, engage in breeding. He's not going to find a female, so by and large, these individual young males keep moving. Now, in terms of how they make their living while they're traveling, they're sort of genetically programmed to feed on wild prey, deer, and that may be why this cougar has sort of settled for the last couple of weeks anyway in southeast Wisconsin. Our suburban areas in Wisconsin have a lot of white-tailed deer. He may have found a easy way to get some food, and he may be camped up there for a bit, feeding on deer.
Do these dispersing males generally come during a certain time of year? Are we more likely to see the sightings, January, February, March? Is that when you'd expect to see them in Wisconsin if they're in Wisconsin?
We can see them any time of year. It kind of depends on their movement paths and when they make it to the state, if they do, and more importantly, maybe when they're observed, when they happen to stroll by a trail camera or the like. But Going back to their likely origin, the western Dakotas, maybe western Nebraska for some of these cats, male cougars will disperse at a younger age often than females, but they'll often hang out with mom until they're about 2 years old. And then when mom has that next litter, sometimes the older offspring end up dispersing. So it might be late winter, spring, early summer that these cats take off into parts unknown, like I did when I was 18 and hopped in the car and headed west. But after that, really at any point, they could be seen across the eastern U.S. essentially.
So for people who have only seen them on a trail cam footage or some surveillance footage, can you maybe just describe some of their notable characteristics and maybe their size in relation to something that people would be more familiar with, like a coyote or wolf? What's kind of the notable characteristics?
Sure. I'm glad you asked that because it really informs the public perception of what they're seeing. We get sightings of things like cougars pretty frequently, and by and large, most of them don't end up being cougars when our staff look at them and look at either the photo of the animal or the tracks that somebody came across. So when it comes to cougars, there are a number of things to look for. First of all, a cat-like appearance, relatively short legs, long body, the round head, the short rostrum or muzzle. When you think about a dog's muzzle, for example, compared to a cat's, that's indicative. But with cougars, there are a couple things. First of all, the coat is held very tightly to the body. It's not really short hair, actually, but it's very dense and held tightly to the body, very uniform. The coloration's very uniform. Even if you find a black and white photograph on your tail camera, if the animal appears uniform, that's an indication, in color, that's an indication it might be a cougar. And then the tail. The cougars have these long, they've been described as club-like tails. If there's hair hanging off the animal, like belly fur or long drooping tail fur, it's not a cougar almost certainly. And then a very distinct dark patch often at the end of the tail. Size is also key because we have lots of feral cats in the state. We've got bobcats. So if somebody comes across a photograph, say off a trail camera or a photo they took while out walking in the woods, and they say, yeah, that definitely looks like a cat, a great thing to do is get some size perspective. Go back to that site, go back to the site where the trail camera was, and take a picture of your friend or stick a yardstick in the ground or something. Take another picture again from that same perspective and compare the two. And if the animal's, a foot or less at the shoulder, it's a house cat. If it's a foot and a half to maybe 2 feet at the shoulder, it might be something like a bobcat. And if it's larger than that, then we can start thinking about cougar, because cougar will be maybe 28 to 34 inches at the shoulder. They're large animals. You could, standing there, sort of reach down without bending over and pet them. So you wouldn't want to do that, but yeah, they're large animals.
Have you ever seen one in the wild? Have you ever come across one in the wild?
I spent quite a bit of time in my early 20s tracking cougars in the mountains of northern Idaho, but never, ever did see one.
Wow.
I was actually sent out as part of my job as a seasonal worker for the Forest Service to investigate sightings of wolves or wolf tracks, because wolves were just recolonizing those areas. And more often than not, they were cougar tracks that we were sent out to investigate. And we would just traipse around hoping to come across this cougar. Of course, we never did. But
what did you learn about them while kind of tracking them, being around where they were? Did you learn anything just personally about cougars and what they're like?
I became fascinated with the country they inhabited. Just beautiful, very remote, mountainous country. But their secretive nature to me. Again, we wanted to see a cougar. We were young then, and traipsing through the mountains of the Rockies, trying to find a cougar was very exciting. So we would be sometimes out on what we thought were very fresh cougar tracks, and we would follow them on snowshoes for long distances and just never see them. So they, at some point became sort of a mystical beast to us. We knew they were there, but we just couldn't catch up with them.
So that kind of brings up, like, why did you get into what you do? Why did like cougars and wolves and bears, large carnivores, kind of become your thing? Why do what you do?
Well, I guess at an early age, kids gravitate toward what just rings with their inner self, right? And it can be anything, right? It could be literature, it could be tennis, it could be hunting. And for me, it was hunting and fishing and spending time in the woods. And I remember being very young, watching a ruffed grouse, a native bird we have here in Wisconsin, drumming on its log. And it was just the most amazing thing to me. I remember finding a fox den on our farm and seeing the female come out of the den, look at me, and sort of just slink back in. Little interactions like that, and I could name 1,000 of them, really connected me with nature. And I became, the more you experience nature, the more you question what's going on. You know, like we talked about, what are these animals doing? How are they making a living? And those questions turn into a passion, and you want to read more, and you want to experience more, and you want to learn more. That turns into a college education. That turns into a career goal. That turns into a career. So kind of inevitable, I think, for folks with interests like mine. We kind of gravitate toward a career in natural resources, yeah.
Do you find it sad at all? I think a lot of studies will tell you that younger generations aren't necessarily hunting as much, or maybe I think the perception is they don't go out in nature as much. Does that make you sad? And is there anything that we can do about that to stoke those interests, to excite people about nature and about animals or hunting or whatever it is?
Yeah, I think it is very sad. And I think that trend has been documented. Certainly across the United States, there's been a downward trend in the number of hunters. The number of folks fishing has remained fairly stable from what I understand. But urbanization, technology, video games, iPods, all these things are incredibly distracting. I shouldn't say distracting. My son will hate me for using that word, but they can consume a lot of kids' time. And I don't know if in the end, when they reach adulthood, it produces the same satisfying, rewarding childhood, curiosity, inquisitive outlook on life that exposure to nature does. There's social research suggesting that things like attention deficit disorder can be linked back to another disorder that's being called nature deficit disorder. Time spent in nature, it turns out, can be very beneficial for kids. You mentioned hunting. I'm a hunter. Some of my kids are hunters. Some have decided not to hunt. But and I don't push them into it. They do it if they have an interest. But to me, one of the benefits of hunting is connecting with nature. Certainly there's a harvest involved sometimes, and that's an important part of my family's food, right? We eat what we harvest, and that's another fabulous, I think, connection with nature. But it's one of many ways, be it camping, bird watching, biking, that can be used to connect people to the outdoors. So how do we address that? Well, I think we let parents know that part of raising a happy, healthy, well-adjusted child is to allow them to explore the world around them. Let them explore nature.
How do you bring the passion that you have for those things, for nature and hunting, and how do you bring that into your current job, which is, on the face of it, would seem like a difficult job because not only you're talking about cougars, you're talking about bears and wolves are a pretty hot button issue. If you see a story about wolves online, there's going to be a ton of comments on it. So it can be, I imagine it can be a challenging job. How do you bring that passion into what you do?
Well, the passion is there regardless. I can't suppress the passion for wildlife. Like I said, it's just part of my inner being. But I guess you're right. I don't know if I would call this job challenging, although it is. Yeah, I guess I would call it challenging. But I think it also comes with a sense of satisfaction. and a sense of excitement in that I tend to work with people who are passionate about wildlife. Some are passionately for the management of these species. Some are passionately against the very existence of some of these species in the state. And certainly they are passionate about the way we interact or don't interact with things like black bears or wolves, etc. So I work every day with people who sometimes are very upset with me. Sometimes they're upset with the DNR. Sometimes they're upset with a particular action or inaction. But that anger reflects passion and interest. And as a wildlife conservationist, again, that is always good to see. You can work with people who are willing to share their thoughts, who are passionate. It's difficult to work with people who won't share what they're thinking. Just the other night, I was with a group of folks up in Medford, and we were discussing wolves, and the majority of the folks around the table were tied in some way, shape, or form to the livestock industry. Most of them were producers. So they, of course, had a very specific view of wolves, and mainly their concern was they had lost livestock to wolves. They'd had cattle chased by wolves, in some cases through fences. And for me, the wolf guy with the DNR, that's critical to understand. Not just understand it as numbers in a table in some spreadsheet, but to actually meet these folks and understand that wildlife in this case is having a direct impact on people's livelihoods and lives, the way they go about their daily existence. So as we as an agency go about developing management plans, in part, we have to structure those plans to address the concerns of folks like those I met with up in Medford.
I imagine the other difficulty is it's also becomes when people are so passionate about it and there are these real world effects of these species, it becomes a political issue, and it's sometimes out of your control. It's the control of the people that are in the legislature.
Yeah, so the DNR operates under a state administrative code. And that code is worked up, developed, and approved through our Natural Resources Board. State statute, and many state statutes sort of set the sideboards for how wildlife species are or not managed. Statutes, those are the laws that are established by the legislature, and we really have no say in those laws or how they're established, unless we're asked for input. Then certainly we'll provide our input. Say there's a law that's been introduced, a bill that's been introduced that might influence turkeys. Our staff specialist on turkeys will likely be consulted for their input. But once those laws are established, those are the laws we live by. But you're right, of course, wildlife, especially when they cross the human interface and there are interactions, like I mentioned, wolves depredating livestock or hunting dogs, etc., then that becomes a political issue. Unfortunately, that puts decisions out of our hands as the managers, on-the-ground managers. Right now, for example, wolves are a listed species, listed as endangered under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which takes authority away from the Wisconsin DNR. So we don't have the authority right now to manage wolves, which is difficult for me. You mentioned the challenges of my job, because I sat in a room with 15 or 20 livestock producers talking about the impacts wolves are having on them, their livelihoods, understanding that I am powerless. Our agency's got no management authority to directly address those issues. So until a point comes where wolves are delisted in Wisconsin, it'll be difficult to actually manage them in a way such as to address these human impacts.
Does the DNR have a management plan for cougars? I mean, since there are so few of them in the state, is there a plan that you have developed for cougars?
We don't, and I should say we don't yet. We do have our cougar response protocols. Given the interest there are in cougar sightings, the fear that it sometimes elicits, and the call for a reaction by the state, we have a set of protocols established that sort of guide what we do and when we do it in response to the cougar, where it is, how it's behaving, et cetera. But in terms of management plan, usually those species management plans, like a cougar management plan, are based on the population. So it's essentially a population management plan. And without a breeding population, there's no real reason to develop that yet. But we understand that there could come a point where we start to see litters of cougars in the state. And we talked about that earlier, the likelihood or when that might happen. But at that point, then a management plan is certainly something we'd work with the public to develop. Yep.
Is the DNR very interested in getting reports of sightings from people? And what do you do with those reports when you get them?
Yeah, we absolutely are. In fact, when you think there's 5.5 million people in Wisconsin and about 0.00001% of them work for the DNR, we've got to rely on the public for sightings of any rare wildlife or plant species that might be out there. So definitely we're interested in reports if people think they see something unusual, especially if they've got some documentation, some scat, a photograph or a cast of a track, a photograph or whatever, video of the animal itself. We want to know about it. And if folks do see something like that or have that evidence, we've got what we call our large mammal observation report form. And if you just search for that on the DNR website, large mammal observation report, it'll take you right to it. You fill it out with all the detail, location, date, time, what you saw, and include as attachments the photos, the video that you might have. Our staff will take a look at it and get back to you. And that's really how we track things like cougars in the state.
You were mentioning earlier, there's been a lot of interest. There's been a lot of press, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions from the public that you get. What's the best question that you've gotten from, whether it was during an interview or from the public about cougars?
Well, yeah, I guess the questions sort of span the gamut. Folks are interested, but, one of the questions that comes up frequently is, should I be afraid? What should I do if I run into the cougar? And I kind of alluded to this before. I think it's very important to be aware. And if there is a cougar, especially if it's been seen very recently in your immediate area, it's certainly prudent to take some precautions. For your pet's sake, don't let them out at night alone. If you take them for a walk, keep them on a leash, things like that. And for yourself, if there's been a cougar sighting, maybe if there's a park nearby, don't go for a walk alone. And again, I don't say that to raise alarm, but these are just part of being aware and acting appropriately. If you do see a cougar, the thing to remember is act large, act aggressive, maintain eye contact, raise your hands, clap your hands, yell at the animal, throw rocks, throw a stick. Convince it that it's there and it's not going to surprise you. It's not going to sneak up on you. And you're not something it wants to mess with. More than likely, it's going to turn and run away. But another thing to remember, don't turn and run yourself, because these are ambush predators. And by running, you're essentially acting like prey. Now, again, I'd reiterate that any sort of negative interactions with people are very rare, even when cougars live in good numbers right in and amongst people, but there's always that chance. So again, if there's been a cougar sighted right in your area, those are some things to think about.
There are areas in the country where they do live very close to large populations of people. Has there been any lessons learned for how cougars can live in kind of around civilization and kind of navigate the human conflicts that may arise, whether it's, farm animals or whatever it is? Has there been some lessons learned from the research of cougars living near civilization?
Yes, an abundance of information. But in general, I would say when we force ourselves into wildlife habitat, say, again, like the Los Angeles suburbs, we build housing developments right up in the mountains where there are cougars, or the animals come down and start to explore our backyards, etc. When that human-wildlife interface becomes sort of gray, management is important. There's going to come a point where cougars are doing things we don't want them to do. So they may need to be captured. They may need to be euthanized and extracted from the situation that way. But from the cougar's perspective, what do they want? They want food and love, right? They want to find something to eat. Yeah. So if there's a deer population in that area, that's generally what they're going to feed on. Now, of course, they will take somebody's dog, right? Occasionally. That's where they're pushing on that human-wildlife interface, and we have to make decisions about whether or not that animal should be managed. But they can become sort of used to humans being in their territories, in their vicinities. So there are examples of cougars just sort of sunning themselves on the median strip of a busy freeway in a very urban area of Southern California, right? So they're very cat-like in their disrespect of people. They don't really care that we're there, just like your house cat. So that it's really interesting when you start thinking about wildlife management in an urban or suburban area and that human-wildlife interface.
In the 1800s, there were a lot more cougars in the state, and they were pushed out, as we were talking about, with civilization's expansion. I'm curious if you've ever gone back and read writings from ecologists at the time. I don't know if Aldo Leopold wrote about mountain lions or cougars at all. Have you gone back and looked at some of the historical stuff in Wisconsin of when cougars were actually living here?
Yeah, and that's actually a really fascinating tale with respect to cougars, but an awful lot of other Wisconsin wildlife species. I don't know if Aldo Leopold dove into this in a lot of detail, aside from passenger pigeons, and certainly he's got a famous essay devoted to the decline and loss of passenger pigeons in Wisconsin. But one of Aldo Leopold's colleagues, a guy by the name of Arlie Shorger, A.W. Shorger, spent his career. Shorger was a chemist. He wasn't a natural resource professional, but he was very interested in nature. And in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, he compiled just a vast library of newspapers from around the state, pioneer journals, and other documentation that he would read through just religiously and document any mention of wildlife. And he's got really, really neat, and I think probably fairly accurate depictions of things like moose in early Wisconsin, ruffed grouse in early Wisconsin. And he does mention cougars. The last cougar was harvested in Wisconsin, I think, in 1909, right? So when we think of these recent sightings in that context, it's to me, it's just fascinating. For 100 years, not a cougar in the state, but our cougars now are sort of emblematic of what's been happening out west in terms of this evolving conservation ethic. And, it's really incumbent upon us to decide, how are we going to react? Are we going to react just with fear and unacceptance of the arrival of this species potentially in Wisconsin? Or are we going to understand that humans and cougars can coexist? We're going to have to draw lines. There's going to be a point where individual animals simply do things we are not going to tolerate. But it's another example of how I think in today's day and age, people and wildlife, even large carnivores like cougars, are learning and can certainly learn to coexist.
Brought up some names of people in Wisconsin's past that have been, who are famous ecologists, conservationists. Do you feel connected to those people? Do you feel connected in this? You're working in the same field. Do you feel connected to people like Leopold, connected to people like Muir? There's a long lineage of people who were ecologists in this state that have done great things that not only for this state, but for the country. So do you feel connected to that kind of heritage in this state?
In a way, I do. Certainly, those are the pioneers in the conservation field. So I operate on a very different plane. Those guys were internationally recognized and sort of generated some of the early conservation ethics and philosophies that still guide us today. So, by default, I feel connected, and I certainly appreciate their writings and what they've done. But sometimes I'm going to upset some of my colleagues in the field by saying this. Sometimes I think we make a mistake when we try to apply their philosophies too rigorously in the current day and age, because the landscape's very different than it was. urbanization, people's lack of connection to nature, the technology that surrounds us, the tools we use to manage wildlife, public acceptance of hunting, all those things have changed. And, our management of wildlife has got to take those things into account. So we're dealing with things that, folks like John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Sigurd Olson, they didn't have to. Not saying their job was easier. They were dealing with things on the heels of the early wars on wildlife, right? The days of unlimited harvests and market hunting. So their challenges were very broad as well. But do I feel connected? I certainly appreciate those folks, and their ethics and philosophies have sort of informed mine. But I realize that my colleagues and I today operate in a very different world than those early conservationists did.
So you've been doing this for most of your career. This is a newer job here at the DNR, but you've worked at the DNR before. You've worked at, I think, the Ruffed Grouse Society?
Rough Grouse Society.
Rough Grouse Society. But so you've worked on a number of different animals, a number of different, different careers, different places. Do you have just like a personal mission of what you want to do, like the things that you're interested in, the things that at the end of your time working in this field that you will have accomplished or like you can look back on and feel proud about?
It's a good question, but sadly it's a question that makes me feel old. It's the first time I've been asked, what sort of legacy do I want to leave? I've been thinking forward to this point, but thanks, Craig. Now I feel like an old man on the long downward slide to retirement. But, I honestly, it's a good question. It gives me a little pause here to think, but I think one of the transitions I've gone through in my career, when I was a young 20-something biologist, I wanted to work with wildlife. It was being in the woods. It was getting my hands on putting transmitters on animals, following them around, doing habitat studies, plant surveys. And while I still very much appreciate being in the woods, what I think I've really come to appreciate is working with people. Because, if you can inform the public about the value of wildlife, if you can impart an appreciation for wildlife, if you can help explain the science behind wildlife management, you can have a much greater impact on the future of wildlife than you do as a guy out in the woods. So I really appreciate working with people, because there are, people, even those that are passionate about wildlife, and we talked about, that sort of continuum from passionate and interested to relatively disconnected and maybe disinterested. But even those who are passionate about wildlife often aren't informed about the way nature works, the way wildlife communities interact, and, things like predator-prey relations, the way that predators and their prey interact and their populations influence one another is incredibly complex. Yet oftentimes the perception by people is that if there's a predator around, the prey are going to be driven downward. Their numbers are going to go down. They may disappear. It's usually not the case. But engaging folks on issues like that can help them become more accepting of the presence of things like wolves on the landscape, perhaps down the road of cougars on the landscape. Not saying predators aren't an important part of these systems, but the way, again, wildlife communities operate is usually way more complex than, there's a predator there, the prey species is going to go extinct. But that's oftentimes, unfortunately, the knee-jerk reaction.
So you, in a way, you're trying to give people the opportunity that you had as a young man searching for a cougar out in the wild. You kind of want to give that opportunity to some other people, some young people that maybe it's a wolf, maybe it's a bear. You want to make sure that those opportunities still exist long after you're done here.
Oh, absolutely. So I live on my family farm, and I manage the habitat there for timber to make a little money, but also for wildlife. And I want to leave my kids and their descendants this legacy of a healthy, wildlife-rich landscape. But imparting to the general public through my career an appreciation for wildlife is important. And you know what's interesting? I've often thought that the current climate where folks are tied into things globally has robbed us of some of our appreciation for our backyard. And I'll just relate a little story here. So for a period when I was teaching at the university, I would take groups of students down to Central America for a couple of weeks every winter. And when we were down there, one of our activities was mist netting or catching songbirds. We would look at the different species. We would talk about where they came from, their life cycle, their migration. And I'll never forget one young woman who was a student of mine grew up in southwest Wisconsin, and I asked her to very gently pull a bird out of the net, and she held it, and she made a comment that I found pretty striking. The bird was a common yellowthroat, just a beautiful yellow bird with a black mask. And she said, "Oh, this bird is so beautiful. Why don't we have birds like this in Wisconsin?" And I looked at her and I thought, you probably have a common yellowthroat nesting within a quarter mile of your house every year, and you've never seen one before. And beautiful birds in Wisconsin, cardinals, bluebirds, ovenbirds, redstarts, they're everywhere around it in our backyard. But again, we've got to get out there and experience them, and that sometimes means putting the TV remote away, shutting off the video game system, and just spending time in nature without a goal. Just go walk, kick stones over, enjoy the sunshine, whatever. But rambling on a bit, Craig, but I think long term, that's what I hope to leave.
It was great to learn more about cougars and great to spend some time with Scott at the DNR offices in Madison. If you're liking the show, please give us a rating on iTunes. It goes a long way in helping new listeners find the show. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at WisPodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.